All right. All right. Now we can begin officially. So I'm going to go around and ask everyone to do three things for me so we can introduce ourselves. It's going to be very quick. I'd like you to give me your full name. Tell me what year you're in, if you're your first year, third, whatever, MA certificate, and just in one hashtag, tell me what economics is to you. What does it mean to you? One word or two words, just let it fit into a hashtag. So um, let's start with the person I see at the top right on my screen is Abbas.
Yes, hello. My name is Abbas Mehrabian. I'm in a graduate diploma program, so it's a one-year program. And Free Economics Radio, I love it.
Free Economics Radio. Okay, awesome. I've read the book. I read the book years ago, and it was quite interesting. I'll probably take a look at that. The podcast is a podcast, right? All right. Thank you, Abbas. Clara, you're next.
Hi, I'm Clara Gepner. So I did the graduate diploma last year and then continued into the MA. So I'm technically in my second year of the MA. For me, economics, maybe the way money is handled in our society, the structure through which money is handled, or the way it's explained. I really don't know that much about economics.
That's perfect. That's why you're here, and that's why this is really an intro class. So thank you for that. Awesome. Alexis, you're next.
Yes, hi. My name is Alexis De Leon, and I am in my third year of the undergraduate program in journalism. And economics, the first word that comes to mind is math. That's pretty much what I have in mind when I think about that word.
Hashtag math. Okay. All right. Excellent. Margaret, thank you very much, Alexis. Margaret, you're next. Hello. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. So I'm a recent graduate from the journalism program. I'm actually graduating in a couple of weeks. And I'm interested in economics in a kind of general sense because I find that it's a big motivator for how decisions are made in the world. And I think the more that we know about that, the more we understand what's going on around us. So that's what brings me here.
All right. Long hashtag, but that's exactly what I was looking for. So thank you, Margaret. That's great. And finally, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Is it Benam?
Yeah, that's right. It's Benam. So basically, I'm not a journalist. I'm an engineer, but I was curious about journalism, so I decided to attend a bunch of workshops to just expand my general knowledge about journalism. So to me, the first word that comes to my mind is cash flow.
So hashtag cash flow. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. I'm going to write all that down so I get a good idea of where we are and where we're starting from. I think we're ready to go. Okay, perfect. So let's just begin with the slideshow here. And just to break it down, I'm going to give you some concepts, and I'm hoping that we can have a conversation as I'm explaining some of these concepts. I'm going to give you some examples. And then after I introduce all of the examples, I have 3 articles. I don't know if we'll get to all 3 articles, but I'm hoping that I'll send you a link, you'll read the article, and then we'll have a discussion about how to apply some of those concepts that we learned during the slides, and to find some good story ideas with that. And then after, we'll see if there's some time for questions, because I imagine that there might be some questions about what I do. I work for for Canada's National Newswire. I've done all kinds of different reporting, so I'm absolutely willing and able to answer any kinds of questions that you may have. Okay, so let's just get started right now. So can I get a thumbs up if we see the slide? We see the slides, everyone sees it? Wonderful. Okay, so let's begin. And I want to give you a quick overview of what we're doing here, okay? I am not an economist, and it's important for you to understand that. I'm not classically trained in economics. I've taken my Canadian securities course, so I'm someone who understands, I understand the financial markets, I understand, I'm into real estate, so I have a lot of investments and that kind of thing. So, and I read a lot about economics. So I'm certainly, I'm well versed in economics and I understand it, but this course is not, I'm not just going to sit here and talk about economics. I'm not going to give you a bunch of models. This is really how to think like an economist, how to use the economic lens to see the world, to understand stories, to see how people are motivated motivated, to see how policies motivate people, and to find really interesting stories and to ask interesting questions that can help you find better stories and be a better journalist. We have someone here. Just let me admit another person here. I want to make sure we got everybody. Who's the new one? Okay, let's continue. So this workshop is not about making you a better business reporter. I think it's important to, oh, we have a lot of people starting. Okay, sorry about that. We have people coming in late, but I assume it's just going to happen as this goes. We'll have people just come in and out here. Okay. All right. So welcome to the new people who just showed up. I see Natasha. I see Diona. I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly, and we'll get to you a little later. And I hope that's you feel comfortable using your cameras and your microphones, because the more I see you, the more we can engage together. So I hope that's going to happen. So this workshop is not about making you a better business reporter. I'm not interested in that. And I want to make you a better reporter. This is for people who like arts, for sports, for business, of course, for politics. The whole point of this is for anyone who has a variety of interests to be able to use the economic lens as a tool. Okay. This workshop is not about whether free market capitalism is better than democratic socialism, or whether you should be more conservative or libertarian or liberal or socialist. This is not about that. All right. It doesn't matter what your politics are, where you situate yourself on the political spectrum. If you consider yourself to be more left wing, more right wing, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this workshop. This workshop hopefully is going to benefit everyone to use these concepts to further the way you want to see the world, the stories you want to write. So it doesn't matter what your politics are, and that's a very important concept to understand as we move forward. As I mentioned, this workshop will teach you to use the economic lens regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. I'm going to talk about why the economic lens is an important tool. It's one tool of many in your journalism toolbox, so to speak. And of course, there are many other lenses. There's a feminist lens, for instance. The federal government is using a feminist lens to look at all of their policies. And what does that mean? It just means to look at how these policies affect women and girls. That's a feminist lens. And anyone can use a feminist lens to understand a policy. This will be an economic lens. So you can use them together. You can use one, you can use the other. This is one extra tool, all right? This workshop will teach you to approach any subject by asking certain questions that will allow you to find compelling stories that stand out, all right? So it's a way to structure your mind, so to speak, to look for certain ideas and certain concepts to ask better questions. Finally, and that's why I asked you about what economics is to you. What does it mean? Economics is not about personal finance, all right? Economics is not about money. It's not about how to run a business, how to predict a stock market, okay? That's not what it's about. Personal finance, perhaps, is about cash flow. It's about money. It's about, administrations, how to run a business, for instance, or HR, how to run employees or how to manage employees. Economics is not about any of that. It's a study of cause and effect. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Well, let's move on, and I can explain to you a little more about what I mean by that. So this is a really good definition that I think really works for economics. And this is something, and there's a lot of different definitions. But for me, the one that I like is this. It's the study of the use or the distribution of scarce resources, or scarce resources, depending on how you pronounce it, which have alternative uses. All right, fundamentally, that's what it is. All right, it's the study of how to distribute, or how a society distributes or uses scarce resources which have alternative uses. Okay, very important concept to understand. And that's essentially what it is about. Now, scarcity means that what everyone adds up to is more than there actually is. Our desires are unlimited, but the resources to produce them are limited. Okay, so I want to ask you a question here. Diona, am I pronouncing them correctly? Is it Diona or Diona?
Diona, yeah.
Diona. So, and I'm hoping that, I mean, you and Abbas and Clara and Natasha and everyone here, you're all breathing, right? Everyone in this room is breathing. Are you paying for the air? Are you paying for the air that you're breathing right now?
Probably. I live near a highway, so, the bad air pollution here. I'm sacrificing my lungs.
you might paying for it in the sense that it's affecting you negatively, but are you paying anyone? Are you giving anyone money for the air that you're breathing right now?
I don't know.
No, not really. And the reason why we're not paying for air at the moment is because air is not scarce at the moment. I mean, there's certain situations where air could be quite polluted, and you might want to not live in those areas. But for the most part, everyone in their apartment right now is breathing air. We're not paying for the air because there's no scarcity with air. There's no economics involved really in studying how air is distributed because there is no scarcity. Okay, can anyone think of a situation where you might want to pay for air? When would that come about?
When there's no air, when air is scarce.
When there's no air, or for instance, I mean, yes, when there's no air and where air is scarce, you would pay for air. Clearly, I know that some real weird eBay sales, they sell air from the Himalayas or something, and you can buy it, and it's like a bottle of air from like some part of the world. But you also pay for air, for instance, when you want to inflate your tires for your bike or for your car. You go to the gas station, you put $1 in, and you pay for the air. What you're paying for really is the instruments that are allowing you to get the air. So the motor, the metal in the motor. The metal could be used for many different things. It's used for that motor. That motor could be used for all sorts of different things, but it's used to pump air. So you're paying for all of the production that's involved in producing that air for you, okay? And that's when economics comes in, because all that metal, that motor, that rubber for the hose, that could be, those resources are scarce and they could be used for different things. So economics comes into play in that way, okay? So that's the idea of scarcity, things that are limited, okay? And the idea of alternative uses is as I just mentioned, each resource can be used for many different things. If every resource that was limited in the world had only one use, economics would be very simple, far simpler than it is now. The problem is that there's alternative uses, and we have to decide, how do these resources get used? And that's what economics is, okay? It's not about money. It's not about business. It's not about running, an enterprise. It's asking the question, how much of each resource should be allocated to each of its many uses? Okay, fundamentally, that is what it is. And that's why it's important to understand that and to use that lens or use that to see the world and to see how the world works. All right, so different kinds of economies are essentially different ways of making decisions about allocating scarce resources. All right, now I'm going to get into that definition right now, and I'll give you an example, and maybe that'll hammer the point home for you as well, okay? So what do we see here? This is ostensibly someone's chalet. I don't know where I got this photo from. I just found it online. I hope there's no copyright issues, but I doubt it. So I'm sure there's a chalet behind here, nice big chalet by the waterfront, okay? And so I wanted to ask you, in Quebec, right? We look at Quebec right now. I know that there's a lot of water in Quebec, but I want to ask you, the land that is close to water, or I guess I'll start here. Human beings for hundreds of years, for thousands of years have loved water. This is not a psychology course. I'm not going to get into why we love water, but we love to be next to water. We love to swim in the water. We love to build our cities around rivers. We love to have homes next to the lakes or oceans, and these properties are very expensive. Okay, so I wanted to ask you, the land that's near water in Quebec, is it limited or is it unlimited?
Limited.
Sorry, Clara?
Limited.
It's limited. There's just only a certain amount of land next to water in Quebec. Okay, and the land that is next to water, it has obviously many different kinds of uses. I mean, what can we use that land for? Anyone wants to talk about what could land next to water be used for?
You can build houses, you can build shopping malls, you can build offices.
Yeah, you can have farms, right? A farm next to water. You can put railroad tracks there. You can just let it go. You can do whatever you want with it. So there has alternative uses, and the land is limited. So it's scarce and it has alternative uses. Okay, and so if you want to have a chalet in our economy, in a free market economy, when we look at a chalet next to water, they tend to be more expensive than the chalets that aren't next to water. Okay, for whatever reason, we like to have chalets next to water. So for instance, if Abbas wanted to buy this chalet, and Clara and Diona also wanted to buy the chalet, who gets the chalet? In our free market society, you all want it, okay? Who gets it?
Whoever pays more.
Whoever pays more. And that's why you tend to have prices in an economy. They increase when more people want an economic good because people tend to outbid one another. And that's naturally how prices tend to increase, particularly when we're talking about resources that are limited, that are scarce, and that have alternative uses. So in our society, we distribute these limited resources by price, for the most part, not always, and we'll get into that. A free market economy, and that's it. The price determines how these resources get distributed. The government is not going through every single real estate transaction and approving it or not approving it. These happen hundreds and if not thousands of times a day, all over Quebec, all over Canada. People are making these transactions and they're doing it based on price. No one is giving anyone land. Okay, now I want you to think about it this way. Let's imagine all of a sudden that now we're in a command economy. Right, we're in a communist society. All of a sudden, Quebec is communist. Okay, and I want to ask you: now that Quebec is communist, the government was elected. It's a communist government. We have a command economy where the state directs the distribution of resources. Is there more land next to water? Is there any more land? No, you're shaking your heads. No, there's not any more land. All of a sudden, do human beings want the land less? I mean, do human beings still love to live next to water? Is there still going to be a demand for people to live next to water? Okay, so in this economy, how are the resources distributed? Who gets the chalet? So Abbas, Clara, Diona, and I'm only saying this because I see your faces. Hopefully other people will show their faces a little later. But who gets it now? We're in a communist society. Who wants it?
Won't they be sharing it?
They could be. They could be. That's a way. Does anyone have another way of how a command economy or a communist society, distributes the resources?
Theoretically, as fairly as possible, and also as randomly as possible, I think.
Well, therein lies some of the issues because essentially it's rules, right? It's regulations. It's whatever that society decides at the moment. So the state could have a vote, or obviously the state has a lot more implication. It's essentially rules, right? It gets divided.
Yeah. May I say, for example, for children, they can choose for kids for, let's say, summer camp.
Yes. And
like a priority, I mean.
Right, you prioritize, but who decides what the priorities are? It would be
government.
The government. So the government has a lot bigger role, and it goes by lists. Perhaps oftentimes when resources aren't distributed by price, it's first come first serve. It's whoever needs it more, decided by a group of functionaries or bureaucrats. Or there's a whole bunch of different ways of distributing these resources. But the point I'm trying to make is that whether you're in a capitalist society, whether you're in a communist society, whether you're in a monarchist society, it doesn't matter, these rules apply. And that's what's important to recognize, is that economics applies. Doesn't matter if you're a communist or a socialist or a capitalist or a libertarian or left wing or right wing, it always applies. You're still having to solve the issue of how to distribute scarce resources in a society, the resources that have that have alternative uses. Okay, do we get that? Do we understand that basic premise? It's very important to understand that. Because so I heard people say economics is cash flow, or it's managing a company or what have you. It's fundamentally, it's not that. Okay. So a few more. So this is what we're going to go through before we get onto the activity. I'm going to talk about supply and demand very briefly. We're going to talk about trade-offs. We're going to talk about incentives. We're going to talk about normative and positive statements, how to distinguish between the two. We're going to talk about looking beyond what is immediately in front of you, and how to see stories, how to find ideas. So let's start with supply and demand. Okay, who wants to try it out, a definition? What does supply and demand mean? I'm going to choose someone if you don't give me a suggestion or an idea.
Supply would be the quantity that suppliers have of the product, and then demand would be how much the consumers, how many consumers want it?
That's part of it. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I mean, supply, thank you for that. So supply is obviously the amount of goods that are available, and the demand is the quantifiable desire, I guess, of people who want it. So yeah, to a certain extent, there's a little more than that. The law of supply states that as the price of an economic good increases, sellers will provide more of it. All right, all else being equal. Now, there's other factors that come into play here. But in general, and the reason why I have laws here in quotations is because economics is not like the hard sciences. It's not the law of supply and demand. It's not like the law of gravity, for instance. All right, when we're dealing with economics, we're dealing with the way people behave. And there's a lot of different factors and different motivations that people have. And so economists try to create models and try to understand behavior. And it's not an exact or hard science. So it's kind of in the middle between the more of the qualitative sciences, like the social sciences, and the the more hard sciences. It's somewhere in the middle. So I say laws with quotation marks because as we'll see, different factors come into play. But yeah, the law of supply says that as the price of a good increases, the sellers will provide more of it. That's why you'll notice that as this article here, as the price of gold increases, more and more people have an incentive to look for gold. All right. As the price of gold increases, the gold that was harder to get, meaning it took longer to get, it took more people to hire to get, the costs were more expensive, it was deeper in the mountains, that gold becomes more profitable. It becomes more interesting to go get it because the price is more, right? So that creates an incentive, and we'll talk about incentives later. So as the cost of something increases, or the price of something increases, you tend to see more of it. Like oil. As the price of oil increases, you tend to get more people interested in exploring for oil, exploring for oil and gas. Okay? So that's what we mean by the law of supply. And you'll notice that a lot when you start thinking about these issues a little more deeply. The law of demand says that as the price of an economic good increases, buyers will purchase less of it. That's kind of intuitive, kind of makes sense. Okay, and it's these two laws that when they interact together, it determines the market price of a good, right? The amount of it available, the amount of people who want it, and that interplay between both determines the price. Same thing as we talked about with the chalet, right? There's only so many chalets available. There's only so much land available near water that if people really want that chalet, they tend to bid it up. They bid up the price and the price increases. And then as the price increases, you tend to have more people interested in building chalets, in finding land to build chalet because they can sell it for a price. Okay. One thing I want to ask you is, this is a little bit of a side question. If an oil producer has oil, okay, and they know that in a year, the price of oil is going to increase, what is that going to do to the amount of oil on the market at the moment? There's a certain amount of oil, and the producers know in 1 year from now, it's going to be significantly more expensive. What happens to the supply? Anyone have an idea?
They don't sell anything for the next year because they know they will sell it later if they gain more profit.
That's exactly it. They hold on to it, so we actually see less of a supply. They'll actually put less on the market because they think they can sell it for more later. So as you see here, when I say a law of supply, right, so if the price increases, there'll be more of it. There's different factors, right? If all else isn't equal, meaning if we know in a year from now, oil is going to be more expensive, you tend to see less of it on the market, which also drives up the price because there's less of it. And if there's the same demand, the price will go up. Okay, so understand these concepts a little bit. I hope to inspire you a bit to, if this interests you, if economics interests you, if what motivates people to behave in society interests you, I hope that you'll look more deeply into this and you'll read more about it. That's a lot of what this workshop is about as well, to inspire you. So understand this. Supply and demand exist regardless of the economy you're in. If you're a socialist, a capitalist, a monarchist, whatever, it doesn't matter. These laws exist. And so regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, you have to understand these laws, these cause and effect relationships that exist in the world. Okay? And if you understand this and you use this economic lens to see the world, you tend to find different kinds of stories. You tend to ask different kinds of questions. and you can set yourself apart from the other journalists because you're really focusing on the cause and effect relationships. Let's find another one. Trade-offs, okay? Who can tell me what a trade-off is? And it seems, and it's kind of intuitive. It's kind of obvious to a certain extent. What is a trade-off?
Would it be how much someone is willing to sacrifice for one thing for like another thing?
That's more of an incentive, or it's the personal desire of someone before they make a decision. And that's certainly, we're going to be talking a lot about what you just said, what motivates people to make decisions. That's next. But the trade-off is more about two different parts of a problem, so to speak. Does anyone else have an idea of what I mean by a trade-off? And I'm giving a hint. The article right here is certainly showing a trade-off to a policy. Anyone else? It's okay if you don't. Yeah, Clara?
Maybe like financial benefits for to make up for something that the government is doing, or like for example, shutting down, or
Okay.
I'm really not sure. I know nothing.
You're heading in the right direction, and the whole purpose of why I'm doing this is because I want you to start thinking about these things differently. So a trade-off is quite simply, it's a balancing of factors. So you're weighing factors, okay, all of which are not attainable at the same time. All right, trade-off exists all the time, and what's important to understand is the economic lens discourages journalists from seeing quote unquote solutions to problems, and instead looks at the world or looks at an issue as a balancing of factors. Okay, so when a politician says, I'm going to solve this problem, the economic lens allows you to think, okay, no, you're creating a policy that has consequences. What are the consequences? You might support the policy, but understanding that whatever decision is taken, there's another side to it. And looking for the other side allows you to find the interesting stories. So really, really simply, the article that we're talking about here is the fact that the government had a problem, right? COVID-19 is circulating in the community. It's a virus that reproduces exponentially. If you don't do anything, you see what's happening in society. You get more and more and more infections. That leads to hospitalizations, and that leads to death. So the government has a problem. And the government says, well, to solve this problem, we're going to shut down restaurant dining rooms, we're going to shut down bars, we're going to shut down gyms, we're going to ban gatherings, and we're going to solve this problem. Now, the journalist using the economic lens doesn't see solving a problem. It sees the government instituting a policy, and on the other end, restaurants are going to go bankrupt and gyms are going to go bankrupt. People's mental health is going to suffer. That's the trade-off. I'm shutting down the economy to save lives, and the trade-off is an increase in mental health problems, bankruptcies, child abuse, domestic abuse. Now, it doesn't mean that the government was wrong, right? That's not the point. The point is to understand that the policy created a whole other thing. So if you think so, instead of thinking of, I'm solving a problem, you think, what are the trade-offs? Okay, that's the economic lens. That's the way a journalist using the lens should approach these issues. So that's what I mean by trade-offs, okay? Trade-offs exist regardless of the economy you're in. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. Okay.
Excuse me. I have a question. If
yes,
I correctly understood, trade-off meaning like just the cons of this policy that we have, right? Well, minus
cons,
right?
Cons is I see where you're going there. A con is kind of, but instead of putting a value judgment, instead of saying, this is bad, you should say this is also what's happening. It's not necessarily a negative. It's just, this is the policy, and this is what else is also happening because of that policy. So you're weighing factors. You're not necessarily saying that these are the negative consequences. You're saying these are the consequences. There could be.
I mean, like the result, the outcome of this policy.
not necessarily the outcome of the policy, because the outcome of the policy of the government shutting down bars and restaurants and gyms would be reduce COVID-19 transmission, right? That's the outcome of the policy, right? The government wanted to slow the transmission, so they shut down bars. The outcome is reduce COVID-19 transmission. The trade-off, and in this case, it's the negative consequences. People's mental health goes up. People go into bankruptcy, but there could be other kinds of trade-offs. There could be positive kinds as well. People, let's say, what could be a positive thing? All of the different kinds of technologies that are being spurred because we have to work remotely, right? That could be a trade-off. But
yeah,
really,
okay, I see. Yeah, I understand.
But you're mostly right though, because most of the times this is kind of negative, and you're looking at the results, and you're weighing them, right? The whole point is that you are balancing the factors of a policy, and the economic lens forces you to see where they are. And oftentimes the interesting story ideas come from that, by asking, what's the trade-off?
Could you
See what
say
I mean?
the desired outcomes versus the unintended outcomes, whether they're positive or negative?
They're not always unintended, because I think that the government knew that if they were going to shut down restaurants, some of them were going to go bankrupt. You know what I mean? And if people aren't able to get into contact with one another, their mental health is going to suffer. So it's not always unintended, but we're going to talk about unintended consequences as well. And that'll be in the section when we talk about looking beyond what's immediately in front of you. And that's looking at the unintended consequences. So yes, unintended consequences is absolutely part of it, but some of them are intended, or some of them are known. Incentives, okay? Another important concept to understand when we're using the economic lens. So who can tell me what an incentive is? And it's not a trick question. It's, what do you think an incentive is?
I think incentive is a kind of motivation that you have based on your needs, based on what you need or what you want.
Incentive is the motivation. That's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. So something that incites, or has a tendency to incite to determination or action. It moves you. An incentive encourages certain kind of behavior. All right. Incentives can be understood as what drive the trade-offs. All right. And I'm going to explain this a little more. A way we can understand how economic decisions affect people is to look for the incentives created by the decisions, as opposed to simply looking at their stated goals. Okay, so I'm going to give you the example of the price controls in Venezuela. Now, before I do that, I want to give you this. Oh, I could have sent you that, CBC restaurants. Oh, there you go. Well, I'm going to send you the incentives in the chat. So, but I think I have to, I gotta, you know what? We don't need to send, I'll just talk about it, and I'll send these links to you after. I think it's probably better that way. So what happened was, this is an article from 2015, but the same issues are happening right now, and Venezuela just reintroduced price controls. So what was happening in 2015 was people in Venezuela were, particularly people living in poverty in Venezuela, or people that didn't have a lot of money, were noticing that the cost of food, of milk, of soap, of toilet paper, of the basic necessities of life were increasing very quickly, and people, particularly people living in poverty, were not able to afford them. Okay, so the government at the time wanted to help people, and so they decided that they're going to make a law. All right, they're going to say that they're going to set the price of these basic food items and basic items in the society. All right, and it was called the Fair Prices Law, if I'm not mistaken. And they decided what the fair price was for things that everyone uses every day, for water, for soap, for eggs, for milk, for cheese, these kinds of things. And so they wanted to make sure that people can afford them. All right, this is something that happens all over the world. Governments want to help people, particularly when they're in a difficult economic situation. They want to make things affordable. So what they do is they say, we're going to put price controls on these items. Okay, now what happened was that almost immediately after, these items disappeared. Okay, there were shortages all over the country. And so the question I want to ask you is, if the government's saying that all these items they existed, right? They're all there. It's not like they just disappeared into the air. All the items were there. Then the government said, in these stores, in the big major chains, we're putting a fair price. So you have to sell it at a certain price. And then the next day, they're gone. Why? What are the incentives that were created that created food shortages and shortages of basic supplies across Venezuela?
So one thing is you can smuggle it out of the country and sell it at a higher price out of the country. Buy it in Venezuela and sell it outside.
So the incentive that was created for some people was they recognized that they could easily sell it for more money elsewhere. Now, that probably is part of it, but because I'm sure people who, I'm certain that was part of it for certain things. What's another incentive? So thank you, Abbas. What's another incentive that was created when the government set the price of something? And obviously was set the price lower. So the price of these basic foodstuffs, milk, cheese, eggs, it was set lower than what the market was setting it as. And then they disappeared. Why? Any other incentive that you think was created?
Is it because it's like the idea where they're sort of like hoarding, not hoarding, but yeah, they're hoarding it, and then later they'll sell it in case, like for the people who want to buy it?
Well, hoarding happens, right? If the price, you're right, if the price decreases, it incentivizes people to buy more of it. Okay, number one. And so that's why often when you go to the supermarket, you go to even at Jean Coutu, you go, even all of us now, whenever they have really good sales, what oftentimes do the sales, they're accompanied by what?
Limits.
By limits. You can only buy 3, you can only buy 4, right? Because they know that when they reduce the price of something, it's going to incentivize you to buy more. So when the government decides that they're going to set the price of all these important items, people run out and get them. So that's also part of it. Another part of it is all along the production chain. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm a farmer and I farm eggs, okay? And the land costs me a certain amount. They'll have to buy chickens. I have to feed the chickens. I have to build a coop for the chickens. I have to hire people to come pick up the eggs. There's fuel costs involved. There's the actual labor of the people driving the cars. There's the people doing the logistics of where the eggs go to the different parts. So there's cost involved all along the chain, all right? And so let's say the cost was, because let's say fuel prices were increasing, so it increases the price of transportation. Let's say, for whatever reason, the cost increase. And so the price in the market was a signal, right? The rising prices of eggs and cheese and milk and toilet paper was a signal that the costs along the supply chain were increasing. Now, whether that was inflation or whether that was the price of fuel or whatever it was, the price is a signal in a market economy. It tells you it gives you an idea of what's happening. And so when the government sets the price of an egg lower than the cost that it costs to produce that egg, does a farmer have an incentive to make eggs? Because they're going to lose money. So think about that for a second. If you're a farmer, if you're growing something and you know that the thing that you're producing, you're going to lose money on it, you're incentivized to stop producing it. So in the long run, these items disappear because the people who are producing them stop producing them because they're no longer incentivized to produce them. Okay, so that's part of the reason. So, and here's a quote from the story. Rodriguez is, I believe she's a, so I'll just start it here. So incentives exist regardless of the economy you live in, right? It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter whether you're left wing or right wing. It doesn't matter what economy you're in. Incentives are the way human beings behave and how they behave and what factors and forces influence them to behave certain ways. All right. This government was a left-wing government. They were a socialist government. And I'm not giving a value judgment on a socialist government. This is not my job here, and I'm not interested in that. But they tried to help people by capping the prices. And what they did is they created food shortages. But there's a trade-off there because either you have food shortages or the people aren't able to afford the items. I mean, because there was an issue that the government had to try and solve, so to speak. So this is what happened. So many of the poor simply can't afford Rodriguez's basics. And Rodriguez is someone who was selling all of these items on the street outside the market. So all of these items disappeared from the shelves across the markets, but they appeared in the illegal markets, right? So all the people took them and then started selling them. And those prices were obviously higher because they reflected the scarcity. They reflected the market, the demand and the availability. So she said, and I don't know if it's a he or she, I apologize, in a raw and arguably necessary display of capitalism, it's a woman, she sells them for far more than the government's legally required fair prices. And that's ironic because those government imposed fair prices that the goods often aren't available at supermarkets at fair prices, as it's simply not profitable to import them. So the government said this is going to be the fair price, but no one wanted to bring them into the country because they were going to lose money on them. So that's what incentives, that's a little bit of what an incentive is. And for you to understand incentives and understand how people are motivated, regardless of the economy you live in, right? If you learn anything today, you know, the economic supplies, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, because we're all on planet Earth, and we all have to make decisions as to how we distribute limited resources with alternative uses. This is a Canadian example of incentives. So we all know, hopefully, being journalism students and graduates, who Doug Ford is. He's the Premier of Ontario. All right. Now he, a couple of years ago, ran on a plan to make $1 a beer. And this was like a little, I guess it was quirky and it sounded good. And he wanted to make beer cheaper for people. He wanted to make people afford beer, and he didn't want to make the beer prices increase. So he said, I'm going to offer you $1 a beer. And what happened? The beer prices increased. Okay. So what happened was that, I'm going to read you a quote from the article, then I'm going to ask you why you think it happened. So when they tried bringing in $1 a beer in Ontario, there was a concept attached to the beer market. So what happened in Ontario, there were regulations before Doug Ford introduced this policy. Every year, the beer across Ontario could only go up by inflation, right? So it set the minimum price for beer. All right, so every year it could go up by a few percentage points, okay? And so it limited the amount that a beer could increase every year. But in order to have $1 a beer, you have to get rid of that regulation because you want to keep it at $1. You don't want the beer to increase every year. So we removed that regulation, okay? So when they tried bringing in $1 a beer, there was a concept attached to the beer market in Ontario, a minimum price floor. And the minimum price floor had an annual escalator. So it was basically a formula that kept up with the consumer price index, and it made sure that the minimum price for beer would increase year over year by a small amount. So he got rid of that regulation, and all the beer prices exploded, 10%. Why? Anyone have an idea?
From what I understand, are they saying like he removed the inflation percentage increase? Is that it?
Yes.
So I think it's just like a way for them to compensate, because in a way everything, like inflation is, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it's sort of like a thing that happens, and right. You know, it's their way of compensating. I mean, if the government doesn't want to do it, then they'll just take it to their own hands.
What incentive was created? So that's a good point, Diana. Oh, sorry, my phone is going off. I'm supposed to have an afternoon meeting now. So the daily afternoon news meeting. So they removed the regulation, and what is the incentive created? So now all these beer companies no longer have a law that limits the amount they can increase their beer. What would happen? They just jacked up their prices because that's the incentive. So if a journalist had looked at this story and looked at the regulation and considered what incentives were being created by this policy, they would have had this story before anyone. They would have had a scoop. But instead, journalists were forced to react. They had to find out after. So it turns out that in order to make $1 a beer feasible, you had to remove the escalator, which means that breweries are now just able to charge whatever they want. And so by instituting a $1 a beer policy, he actually made beer prices more expensive in Ontario. Okay? So this is how incentives work. And if you are a journalist and you want to use the economic lens, you'll be able to see this earlier, right? You'll be able to have more of an insight over other reporters. You'll be able to have scoops. You'll be able to see what motivates people and find better story ideas. This is the last example that I have here, and this is about looking longer term. So Clara had mentioned the unintended consequences of a policy, and this is part of it, okay? So this is a very famous book called Economics in One Lesson, and I hope, and at the end of the course, if you give me your email, I'll send you a list of interesting books to help you out on the subject. So the art of economics consists looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act of policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups, okay? So I'm sure everybody here has heard of Ubisoft before. They do the Assassin's Creed video game. They're a French multinational, all right? Ubisoft, a long time ago, years and years ago, was, I guess I'll start with the government. The government created a policy, where they incentivized businesses to move to Quebec, particularly software companies, visual effects companies, video game companies, and they said that we're going to subsidize 30% of the salaries. So all the employees of Ubisoft, 30% of their salary is actually paid by the government, okay? And this was done to incentivize businesses to move to Quebec. This was done when the Quebec economy was quite low. There was unemployment, and the government wanted to create more jobs, create better paying high-tech jobs, all right? This policy was actually quite successful. So successful that now it's causing problems, all right? So companies like Stingray in Montreal, a whole bunch of other high-tech companies are actually quite upset with the government, and they're upset with Ubisoft because they're saying what you're doing is you're stealing all of the labor. And so I wanted to ask you what is the issue here long term? Why is Ubisoft stealing? Why are they being accused of stealing labor? Why are all the other tech companies in Montreal upset by Ubisoft?
Because Ubisoft can pay more to the employee because they get some of the money from the government, so they can pay more than other companies, and all good engineers go to Ubisoft.
That's exactly it. Because if you look at it this way, Ubisoft and another company, Stingray, let's say the market price for a salary is, as an example, $90,000. Okay, so Ubisoft can look at what the market price is, what all the other companies are able to pay, and then they can pay 30% more, because that 30% is given back to them by the government. So what this policy did, it essentially guaranteed Ubisoft the best few thousand people, or the highest paid few thousand people in Montreal's labor pool. All right, so because there's a limited amount of labor, right? And it's the same thing. An economic good is also people's labor. So in Montreal, there's a limited amount of high-skilled people, and those high-skilled people can work anywhere. They can work for Stingray. They can work for Shopify. They can work for Lightspeed. They can work for video game. The people who have that high-tech, those skills can work anywhere. And so what's happened now is that all the different companies, the ecosystems that have built up in Montreal are now at a huge disadvantage. And what that's doing is having unintended consequences. So right now, Quebec is home to one of the stronger economies in the country. It still is. This was before the pandemic, but it still is. All right. There isn't enough talent to go around in Montreal and Quebec City. So what that's doing is it's forcing ambitious companies to scale back production. So Montreal can't even grow a lot of the companies that are here because there's such labor shortages, and a portion of the taxes that these companies are paying to the government is going to subsidize their competitors. So this is something that's an unintended consequence. This is something that that encourages you to look beyond what you can immediately see. So when you have a government saying, well, we're going to create jobs, we're going to subsidize all these jobs, the economic lens encourages you to say, okay, what else is going to happen? The money that you're putting here is money that you're not necessarily putting somewhere else. The companies that you're subsidizing now means you're not subsidizing others, and you're putting them at a disadvantage. Right? When the government says they're going to give $150 million to Cirque du Soleil because it's a really important company, it has a lot of jobs. Well, that's $150 million that can't go to all the other artistic companies in Quebec. Right? So the idea of the economic lenses says, what's the policy that the government is instituting? What else is happening? Where is that money not going? How is that affecting everybody? Not just the people in the press release, not just the people that the government is talking about, but what about everybody else? Okay? That's what that means when I say looking longer term. That's what I mean that's what it means when I say the art of economics is looking at how policies affect the whole group long term, not just what you see. So when you go to a press conference, when you're looking at a story, when you hear a government instituting a policy, you know, the bad reporter or the reporter who's lazy writes about what they immediately see. The reporter who's using the economic lens, who's thinking deeply, thinks, what are going to be the unintended consequences? What are the consequences down the line? What are we likely to see here? And that might not be the story of that day, but that's a good feature idea, right? It's a good way, it's a good vein of ideas to mine, so to speak, right? So this is what I'm trying to help you with today, is to see the world a little differently, to see the cause and effect relationships of policies, okay? Just a couple more quick things before we have our activities. So normative and positive statements, what does that mean? All right, a normative statement means how you think the world should be, right? It's a matter of opinion, it's your judgment, it's a value judgment, okay? A positive statement is something that doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it can be tested, all right? These statements have no value judgment. They are based on empirical evidence. And as a journalist needs to be able to distinguish between the two, to know is this a value judgment? Is this a normative statement or a positive statement? Because all policy in government is created by both, right? All of these decisions that are being taken, there's normative and positive statements in economics in there. There's both, and you have to know what the difference is. A normative statement. Keeping schools open during a pandemic is more important than keeping restaurants and bars open, okay? Who can tell me why that's a normative statement?
Because it's saying that one thing is more important than the other. So this is obviously an opinion, but someone might be able to contradict and say that keeping restaurants open is more important than schools.
Exactly. It's a value judgment. You're saying something is more important than another. It's hard to test that. How do you test what importance means? Right? Understand what that means by normative. A positive statement would be keeping schools open during a pandemic will lead to fewer mental health problems among children and allow parents to continue to work, benefiting the economy. Now you can test that. You can see if that's true or not. You can see if more kids are actually having mental health issues with surveys, with doctor appointments, with focus groups, with all kinds of different things. You can see if more parents are at work or not. You can see if the economy is increasing based upon our indicators like GDP, okay? A normative statement. The cost of food is too high and the government should impose price controls. Now, these are things you hear a lot. In the city of Montreal, the cost of housing is too high and we have to create affordable housing options. Now, I'm not saying that's bad or good, but that is a normative statement. A positive statement, imposing price controls on food will force store owners to sell at a loss and will trigger food shortages, okay? Understand the difference. Positive statement, normative statement. One more. The video game industry in the city is influential and should continue to receive government policies, right? These are people's opinions. These are judgments. As opposed to subsidizing the video game industry allows some companies disproportionate access to a limited labor pool of skilled workers in Montreal. Okay? So virtually all public policy stems from both normative and positive statements, or normative and positive economics. You have to have both. You have to start with a value judgment. Oftentimes governments decide to create a policy because they see something that they want to change. That's a normative statement. That's a normative economics. And then when they actually create those policies, you have to be able to distinguish between what can actually be tested. All right, what is, what can be verified? Are we good? Because I want to ask you all about these later. Normative, positive, incentive, trade-offs. All this is coming to a crescendo here. There's a point to all this. All right, summary before we have the activities. Economics is the study of how scarce resources with alternative uses are distributed in society. Okay, this is what it is. Please understand that if you learn anything today. It's nothing to do with the money in your bank account. It's nothing to do with the stock market going up or down. It's not about that. The laws of economics apply regardless of the system a society uses to distribute scarce resources. Whether you're in North Korea, whether you're in China, whether you're in France, whether you're in South Africa, Montreal, you're all doing the same thing. You're all making decisions on how to distribute these resources that have alternative uses. The price of a good will influence its supply, as well as the amount of the good that buyers will purchase. The interaction of these laws of supply and demand determine the market price of an economic good. We learned that earlier. An economic lens encourages journalists to negotiate issues as trade-offs, as opposed to encouraging journalists to look for solutions to problems. When you're using the economic lens, you're not just seeing what is the solution to this problem, you're seeing what are the trade-offs? What's happening because of the policy that I'm instituting to solve my problem? What else is happening? This else is where the stories are. It's where you find your story ideas. It's what allows you to set the news agenda. It's what allows you to have scoops. It's what allows you to be different than everybody else, because you're looking for motivations and incentives and you're finding your stories. This is where good journalists find their stories. They look at what's beyond what's being said. All right? Ask any successful journalist. They find their stories by going off the beaten path. They find their stories, their scoops, by doing what different than what everyone else is doing. The economic lens encourages journalists to seek out the incentives created by a policy, as opposed to encouraging journalists to focus solely on the stated goals of that policy, right? Look at the cause and effect relationships of the ideas, whether it's a corporation coming up with a new product, whether it's a government instituting a new policy, whether it's a sports team or a sports league expanding. There's all kinds of different subjects that you can apply this to. This is not just for business reporters. It has nothing to do with business reporters, really, right? This is all about politics as well. If you're an arts reporter, if you're a sports reporter, whatever it is, you use the economic lens to see the world differently, to see the cause and effect relationships. A normative statement is a matter of opinion, while a positive statement can be tested. Right? The economic lens encourages journalists to distinguish between the two. And finally, the economic lens encourages journalists to seek out the longer-term consequences of an economic policy. All right? Not just for one group, but for all groups. All right? Before we get into the activity part, I just want to ask you if there's any questions. Was this helpful? Are you able, you think, to approach the news in a different way because of everything I introduced you? Do you think it was helpful? Yeah?
I guess it's helpful for reporting about some problems. Let's say I like the statement that it can solve. The journalists look for solutions to the problems. So it kind of like constructive journalism, if we see deeply in the problems.
That's it. It allows you to look deeper, long term. Look at the people who might be affected by a policy that aren't immediately in front of you. Right? That's what's key. And you can use the economic lens along with other lenses as well, as I mentioned. The Marxist lens, the critical race theory lens, the feminist lens. I mean, there's so many different ways to see the world. This is another way. Okay, Article 1. I wanted to choose 3 subjects that affected people, okay? And housing affects everyone. I know that in Montreal, I'm assuming that you've all noticed that the price of homes has increased over the past few years. And it's causing the city to want to solve this problem, right? The problem is that young people, young families, people who are living below a certain, I guess not necessarily everyone who's living in poverty, but people who just essentially aren't very wealthy are having an increasingly difficult time of buying a home in Montreal, finding a home in a central neighborhood, finding a home that has enough rooms for their children, finding a home that is next to a school. So there's all kinds of difficulties that are occurring because the cost of housing in Montreal is increasing quite rapidly. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to send you the article. You're going to read it individually, okay, and in groups. And I'm going to ask you to come up with a normative and positive statement about Montreal's housing crisis. So I'd like you to choose one person to speak on behalf of the group. I want you to talk about the trade-offs to the policies that you read about in the article. What are the trade-offs to rent control in particular, right? What's rent control? Well, it's a price cap, so to speak, right? The government is putting a price cap on the cost of renting homes in Montreal. What are the consequences to rent control in Montreal? Again, it doesn't mean that, I'm not saying you have to be against rent control. I'm saying when you look at rent control, you should be able to understand the trade-offs in this government policy. And what are the incentives created with this government policy to create more affordable housing in the city of Montreal? All right. And then I want you to come up with some ideas for stories. Now, I said 3, you can just choose one. I mean, I'm not going to hold it to you, but I want you to have a discussion with the people in the group about these kinds of issues and how to approach it. And then I'll give you about 15 minutes and then we'll reconvene. So let me stop sharing for a second here. And I'm going to get out of this for a second. Okay. So I'm putting this in the chat. This is to everybody. So now everyone should be able to have the link to the article from CBC. You have the questions that I'm looking for you to ask. And now I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. Okay. Actually, because, hold on here. All right. I'm opening all the rooms. Right now it's 2:08, so 2:10. I'm going to come back in 2:20, 2:22, 2:23. Okay. Hold on. Now I have, you know what? I'm just going to do 2 rooms now because I think people are, yeah, hold on a second here. No. There we go. Okay. Enjoy. I'll be back. Okay. Everyone can see? Thumbs up? Yes? Good. Okay. So there were 2 groups, and anyone can really jump in on this. Doesn't have to be, I don't know if you designated someone to speak or maybe that you can alternate. It's up to you. So we'll begin with Abbas and Alexis because I see that you're at the top of my screen here. So we'll start with the first question. What's a normative statement and what's a positive statement when it comes to Montreal's housing situation?
Yeah, so one normative statement is house prices in Montreal are too high. And a positive statement is that Mayor Valère-Plante said that every year 600 social housing units will be created in Montreal. That's
perfect. That's exactly it. The normative statement, Montreal housing prices are too high. Now, when you say something like that, as a journalist, you need to think, okay, that is a normative statement. That's not really something I can test because too high, the word too is subjective. It's a value judgment. It's something that the city is going to use to make a policy. But as a journalist, you need to look a little more further and recognize that's a value judgment. And then you look at the positive statement and you say, okay, well, Montreal said that their policy is going to create 600 units. Now, that's obviously a great story idea looking forward. Or is it actually doing that? You know, is the policy actually going to create 600 units? Where are the units going to be found? Anyway, I don't want to advance you and give you story ideas. We'll talk about that later. So yes, both of those are perfect. One normative, one positive. Group number 2.
So we actually had the same positive statement. Plant says this would create about 600 social and 500 family housing units a year. But our normative statement, we just also took it from the article. Montreal has to remain an island for everyone and not just for the most affluent.
There you go. Montreal has to remain an island for everyone and not just the most affluent. So you'll notice how politicians, they start oftentimes with a normative statement, and then they try and put together some sort of a positive economics, a positive statement to try and address the normative issue. So again, I like that you're both both groups are clearly able to distinguish between the two. And when you're doing your journalism, when you're looking for stories, recognize the difference between those two statements. Recognize things that can be tested versus things that are just value judgments of politicians or value judgments of advocacy groups, for instance. Okay, and in that differentiation allows you to find the stories as well, to find the news articles. Okay, to find the story ideas. All right. Now we get into the more difficult things, the trade-offs. I don't know if you spoke, Abbas or Alexis, if you spoke directly about rent control, but maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But what are the trade-offs for this housing plan?
Alexis, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, so what we said was definitely the contractors themselves or the builders would definitely be affected by this. We mentioned that. I think Abbas took note of other points that we mentioned. Abbas, can you quickly mention?
Yes, so we said that if they may use cheaper quality material for building these social houses because they are not getting so much profit out of it.
Okay, that is well. So you'll notice how the trade-offs also touch on incentives, right? So the builders who are not going to get as much money for these buildings, for these units, might be incentivized to use cheaper products. Right, that's why you often find that housing that's affordable housing, community housing, low-cost housing, the materials are cheaper, right? Because the money that you're going to get in return is going to be less, so you have less of an incentive to be able to build more expensive. A story idea, you can look into that. What are the materials that are going to be used to build this housing? Is it going to be the same as the other ones? What are these housing units going to look like that are going to be affordable or low cost or subsidized? So there you go. That's one. So the trade-off. So that's what you saw. You saw that they're going to build affordable housing. They're going to solve the problem. The problem is high housing increases, and then the solution is, or to the government, the solution is affordable housing. But the trade-off is the housing might be less quality. Okay, all right. It's group two. What is the trade-off that you saw when it comes to this affordable housing plan?
Diona, I don't know if you wanted to speak, but because I took notes.
No. Yeah, I didn't take notes.
Okay. So actually, it's funny. Well, not funny, but we also had that same idea about like the companies maybe cutting costs and thus reducing the quality of the housing. That was actually one of our story ideas. But for trade-offs, we said we took it from the article. They say it could cause developers extra and force them to pass the cost on to other tenants or property owners. So that's a potential trade-off. And then for rent control, we said it could have an effect on the value of the neighborhood, perhaps in terms of like how hip it is or like gentrification wise. And it could also dry up the rental market because people lose incentive to rent out and decide to sell instead.
All right, that's a lot of really good stuff there. So I took some notes. So you also looked at the difference in the quality of the housing. That could be a trade-off. Okay, what was the other trade-off that you said? The trade-off would be the quality of housing, and then you said what else?
So we said that kind of like the value of their neighborhood. We didn't really know how to describe it, but like Diona made the comment of like how gentrification works and if the housing is more expensive, then it drives in more expensive housing and all that. And when housing is less expensive, then it does the opposite effect. And the other trade-off was that rent control can dry up the rental market because people lose incentive to rent out and decide to sell instead.
So that's both groups had excellent points there. You know, one of the trade-offs and one of the unintended consequences that might come out of this affordable housing plan is that all the other housing gets more expensive. Okay, now why would that happen? Well, if a builder is planning on building X amount of units, and then they either have to pay into a fund, or they have to build lower cost units, they're going to get less money from those lower cost units, and they're going to have to lose money because they have to put money into a fund. Those costs, as mentioned in the article, might be passed on to the other units. So by creating the affordable housing and by creating money into a fund, they're actually raising the price of all the other units. Now, that's something that you might want, because what the city is probably doing is saying, well, the people who can afford to buy a unit might have to pay a little bit more in order to create those subsidized housing. So yes, it's going to increase the price a little bit more, but it's a way of distributing those resources, and it's a way of redistributing the money. The people who can afford it can pay a little more, and the people who can't are benefiting from that because there's low-cost housing being created. But I also wanted to ask you, how is low-cost housing distributed? Because in Montreal right now, when a developer builds a condo tower, if you want a unit, you buy it, right? If you want a more expensive unit, you pay more money. If you want to buy a unit from another seller, oftentimes you'll see auctions happening all over Montreal. People are trying to outbid one another. So when you have affordable housing, who gets that housing? Because it's not based on price. It's not distributed based on price. How is it distributed?
Who gets the housing? Is that your question?
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear. Yeah, how are the units distributed?
Yeah.
And price is not the factor.
Factor, yeah. Actually, I used to like visit meetings for people who were having house problems or like homelessness, and I realized that when it comes to affordable housing, they wait for years to be in the list, and usually it goes by the top. So if you have family members, if you have children, typically you're in the top, but if you're a single man, it's like you're usually like they don't prioritize you.
Right. And so that is also really interesting story ideas right there. You know, look at the lists of affordable housing in Montreal. Who gets on those lists? Now, this may not be a good thing to say, but I have friends who found affordable housing because they knew someone in the building. Now, those are two people who don't even need it. They just wanted a cheaper house. So, and is that happening often? Well, when you don't have price dictating who gets what, you have to find another way to distribute those resources that are scarce, that have alternative uses. So when this list method could be abused, and that's a really good idea there. So if you know that you're getting all these affordable housing, the journalist in you, using the economic lens, should think, who's getting these homes? Who decides who gets these homes? Who's running the decisions about who gets these homes? Who's on the board of the people who decide who get these homes? Are there conflicts of interest on the board of the people who are distributing these homes? Who are the people who get it? Is it often single men? Are they disadvantaged? Is that maybe an interesting story? Finding a couple of men who are unemployed, who have been looking for social housing for a really long time. And maybe you can do a profile on them and saying an unintended consequence is that families, maybe older people, are privileged, while single men who might be in their 40s or 50s who are unemployed are underprivileged. Now that could be an interesting story, maybe. It may not be, but that's a different way to look at it, right? So when you look at the unintended consequences and you look at the trade-offs of these policies, you find interesting story ideas that may not be told. Okay. Rent control. What's interesting about rent control is that it's a price control, right? The government caps the price of things. Now, I guess we can talk about that for incentives as well. So maybe we'll talk about rent control when it comes to incentives. So I guess we'll start with Group 1 with Abbas and Alexis. Can you talk about the kind of incentives that are created when the government creates an affordable housing policy, or the one that this government created?
Yeah, I think the main one was for the builders to build more houses and use lower material quality, because they are incentivized for building as many houses as possible, and they may not care that much about the quality of the housing.
Okay, so that touched on the trade-off as well, and you notice that these issues overlap, right? And that's normal. Group two, what is the incentive that you saw? Is that all, Abbas? Did you have another one?
Yeah, I think that's all, except if Alexis wants to add.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, that was what we mainly covered. Yeah.
Okay, great. And that's exactly it. And I have a few others, and I'll get to them after I hear from group two. What were the incentives that you saw that were created from this policy?
It was actually exactly the same thing. The sentence where they say that the more housing they build, the more developers get money, and yeah, I mean that's the incentive for them to build. But then it's also incentive to cut corners and decrease the quality of the housing they build.
And so you'll see that the city of Montreal, they're coming up with a socialist policy. And that, I'm not giving a value judgment on whether that's good or bad, but even with that socialist policy, they're using incentives. They're saying we're incentivizing these companies to build more. How do you incentivize them to build more? Well, you pay them. So that's where the city is using incentives to get what they want. And the builders are having other incentives as well. Now, in terms of rent control, this is something that, you know, a lot of people argue for rent control. And I think that you can certainly say that rent control in Montreal has benefited certain people. Obviously, if you're living in a home and you're on a fixed income and all the prices are increasing all over, but yours is not, that is certainly beneficial for you, clearly. And that's why people advocate for rent control. But there's other effects that come about with rent control. Okay, one of them is that it distorts the distribution of the homes around the city. So I'll give you an example. If you lived in an apartment with 3 bedrooms, you had 3 roommates, and it was in a really nice part of the city, and you were spending about, I don't know, a couple of years ago, a 3-bedroom apartment in Montreal was probably about $1,000. Now it's a lot more, but before it was, and if you have rent control, if you've been there for a long time, you can probably get a really nice 3.5 in Montreal, or excuse me, like I guess 5.5 or 6.5. Let's say it's $1,000. Okay, you have 2 roommates who leave. It's just you. Okay, your house is under rent control. What are your now? Do you have an incentive to move to a smaller place and leave that house to a family that might need those 2 extra bedrooms? Or are you incentivized to stay in that place because it's so damn cheap? Right? You're right. I mean, Abbas, yeah?
I would stay.
You would stay. You would stay. You would find other roommates, other probably young people like you. You would find other roommates. So in a rent-controlled environment, it distorts the distribution. If we were living in a place where we didn't have rent control, that one person living in that 3-bedroom apartment would not stay there because they likely wouldn't be able to afford it. They would move to some place that could accommodate one person. And then that apartment would free up to a family that may have the money to be able to house their children. So in Montreal, we noticed that there's not a lot of housing available for families, particularly apartments with 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, but there's a lot of apartments, but there's not a lot of them on the market. And so the trade-off with rent control is that the housing stays cheaper, but there's distortions in the way that it's distributed, and that's why you see shortages. Notice how you see shortages in this? That's why there's always shortages in Montreal. Part of the reason is rent control. And that's why families are moving off island. And so the city imposes rent control, or the province does, in order to keep rents low and encourage people and families to stay. But inadvertently, it actually pushes a lot of people out. Now, I don't know if it's better to just let the market decide, because only wealthier families would be able to stay, right? So it's a very difficult balance. I'm not saying rent control is bad. I'm saying rent control has a trade-off. Right? Rent control isn't a solution to a problem. Rent control is a policy that addresses certain things, but that creates other issues. Another issue, you'll notice that in neighborhoods that have older buildings, that have a lot of rent control, the infrastructure is a lot poorer, meaning that the windows need to be replaced. The plumbing is bad. Look at all these older apartments in the plateau. I don't know if you ever lived in a plateau, but that housing stock is not very good. Compare it to the newer places where you're able to actually, because when you build a building, there's no rent control. You can sell it or you can rent it for as much as you want for the first person. Okay? So if you're an owner and you know that you're not going to be able to get the price that's going to cover the cost of renovation, do you have an incentive to renovate that apartment? Have you thought about that? Have you noticed that rent control disincentivizes landlords from making renovations to their apartment? And so that's why the government creates programs, right? The green program. So we'll pay the first $2,000, $3,000 for you to replace your windows, for you to redo your roof, for you to do plumbing. And they say we'll make it eco as long as you make it, you know, green and you have a white roof that reflects the sun, or you have windows that are energy saving. We'll give you money. That's an incentive for people to do renovations in an environment where they can't increase the prices because they're in rent control. So you see how you have to add in different policies and incentives within your regulation when you know that you're in an environment that creates disincentives to actually renovate. Now, you still might believe in rent control. That's fine. But as long as you have to recognize that in an environment with rent control, you tend to get shortages of housing because people hold on to it for dear life because it's cheap. And the quality of the infrastructure tends to be less strong because the landlords don't have the money to be able to do it because they still want to make a profit or they want to cover their costs. Finally, let's look at story ideas. And we'll start with Abbas and Alexis. What are the story ideas that you came up with for this?
Well, one of them, I remember we mentioned, because I know each borough in Montreal has its own taxation system. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's called the mill rate or something like that. How does these rent control units or policy impacts the taxation of those boroughs where they are situated?
Okay. So if a place has, if a borough, because of the rent control and it has older stock, there's less revenue that's coming from those buildings. So the government is getting less money, and therefore, does that cause taxes to go up because the government needs to collect more revenue because it's losing it on the amount of on the revenue that they're getting? Yes and no. So the issue is that when you have, let's say, you have a 5-unit apartment building, the revenue that you're making goes to the provincial government. It doesn't go to the city. The city gets the municipal taxes, and the municipal taxes are based upon the evaluation of that building. And you're right, Alexis, the evaluation of the building depends on the amount of rent that you get. So the more rent that you get, the higher the building is valued. The higher the building is valued, the more taxes the city gets. So by keeping rent control, the city is actually depressing the prices of those properties to a certain extent, and therefore they're collecting less taxes. So that's an interesting story right there. How much money, maybe you can speak to an economist and you can find out how much money is the city losing by keeping rent control in certain parts of the city. That's an idea right there. Yeah, good job. Is there another one or should I move on?
Yeah, another idea was we were curious why these boroughs were chosen and not a borough like Westmount. And so we thought that one idea is to talk to the neighbors in these neighborhoods and ask them if they're happy with this idea of building this social housing in their neighborhoods, because it will impact the community and the neighborhood. So some of them may be unhappy of, I don't know, lots of income families coming to their neighborhood or things like this. So talking with neighbors.
Yeah. That's interesting. You actually took a social lens on it, looking how it impacts human beings and how it impacts the people there. And I think that that's a great idea for a story, but I'm not sure if that's really the full economic way of looking at it. Here's another way that could be used. So when you said, you'll notice that the affordable housing plan is only in Saint Laurent and another borough. Okay, so what that means is they're creating a situation where if you want to build in Saint Laurent and the other borough, it's going to be more expensive. Okay, so what that does is it incentivizes you to build somewhere else. So maybe you want to go, because what you're saying is we're imposing costs on you if you want to build here. So the incentive that gives to the builder is, why don't I build there? So maybe you can call up the borough of Saint Laurent and say, what do you think that the city is actually making it more expensive to build in your neighborhood? Do you fear losing units? Or do you actually think there's going to be less overall units in your neighborhood because it's now more expensive to build in your neighborhood? Another thing that, another way of looking at trade-offs and incentives. Right now, Montreal's electric rail called the REM is building, it's making it easier for people from Brossard to come into the downtown core. It's making it easier for people in the West Island and North to come into downtown. And so if it's more expensive to build in Montreal because of these rules that the city is building, and we know that it's actually going to take about 10, 15 minutes to actually get to work in downtown if you live off island, is the city of Montreal actually incentivizing urban sprawl? Are you incentivizing people to live further and further away from the city because you're imposing all these restrictions inside the city? Now, again, these questions are difficult, and that's why you can't look at it as solutions, right? The city of Montreal is not solving the housing problem, or excuse me, it's not solving the housing prices increases. It's creating rules on how to build in Montreal, but what that's doing is incentivizing people to move out of Montreal, or it's incentivizing builders to build where there's less restrictions. So that's the trade-off. That's the incentive. That's the economic lens. Okay, that's what I'm trying to encourage all of you today, how to think. And let's move on to the second group for story ideas, because we're almost done for today. I can't believe I thought of 3 story ideas. We only did 1, but I guess that's okay. So what story ideas did group 2 come up with?
So we had a few. I think Diona suggested one feature on the people who have been waiting for decades to get affordable housing. We talked about the long-term effects, so potentially increasing prices for other tenants and property owners. The same story, more money for more housing could lead developers to building more, but cutting costs and reducing the quality of the housing. And that was it, actually. Well, I said one on Airbnb and how like Airbnb affects the amount of housing units and how that policy could potentially affect amounts of Airbnb units. Although that's been changing a lot with COVID anyways, but.
Well, I mean, that's exactly it. And all of those stories are really interesting ideas to be able to pursue. And I think that you kind of got the idea here and what I've been trying to, in the way that I've been trying to encourage you to think. It's just that, you know, these policies are difficult. It's difficult to govern. It's difficult to be the mayor of Montreal or to be the premier of Quebec. You have a lot of decisions to make, and you're dealing with millions of people interacting and you know, signing contracts with one another and living with one another. And every time you kind of put a policy together, you're imposing a certain view, and you're necessarily having consequences. And that's why there are people who are more on the right side of the spectrum, the people who consider themselves more conservative and free market. They say, no one is ever able to know exactly what's good for millions and millions of people. And so the best way to manage a society is to let people make their own decisions. And that's why you have conservative governments that come up with child allocation payments. The left-wing view is to create a program for everyone. The more right-wing view is to just give people money and tell them, you do what you want with it. And so, but there's goods and bads with that. And there's trade-offs with that. Politicians are not experts in everything, and you're never going to know what's good for millions of people, but you need some sort of a government to manage a society, and you have to create some sort of policies. And so, you know, laissez-faire, more right-wing, lets the market decide, and there's obvious consequences to that. People get priced out, and benefits people with more money, and there's all kinds of different issues that deal with that. But on the other side, when the government tries to impose regulations and make rules, there's all kinds of different distortions, and there's different things that are created. And the journalist, using the economic lens, is to be able to distinguish between that, is to be able to see the effects of those policies, and that's where the stories are found. So we're coming up on time. You guys have been really great. Thank you for engaging with this workshop. It wouldn't have been good without you engaging and giving your opinion and helping out. So thank you. before I close, are there any questions that you have for me? And I'll just do one thing here. I'll share my screen. Oh, I am sharing my screen here. I was going to do something on liberals' pandemic spending, on media bailouts. That was going to be fun, but anyway, it is what it is. This is my email. You can email me if you want a list, if you want me to send you these slides, if you want to have this information on your own to take a look at it. You'll also have the quotes in there, and you'll get some, I can send you some lists of books that really shape the way I see the world in terms of my view and my approach. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate. So use the email if you want to send any questions to me. And I guess before we go, is there anything that you want to mention? Is there anything that you have to say before we sign off?
Just wanted to say thank you. This has been very illuminating.
Was it helpful? Do you actually see the world, not see the world a little differently, but do you understand what I mean by the economic approach to certain articles and things? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting viewpoint and changes how one sees the world. So thank you for that.
That was the point. I wanted to change the way you look at the world a little bit, and to understand that this is one way, this is one tool. As I said, you could use the social lens, the feminist lens, the critical race theory lens. You could use all kinds of different lenses, different tools. This is one of them. This is one way to find stories, okay? One of multiple. The Marxist lens, I mean, there's so many different ways to look at the world. This is one of them. So I really appreciate, I'm happy that you see the benefit. And that's what economics is. It's understanding behavior. It's cause and effect. Everyone deals with it, okay? Economics is not about being left-wing or right-wing. It's not about money. It's not about men sitting at table counting money. It's about the way human beings interact, okay? All right. Thank you all very much. Robin, I guess I'll let you close the seminar.